Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so thrilled to have you here today. My name is Nicola Corzine, and I am the founding executive director of the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center. Now, if you're joining us today for the first time, we're delighted to have you here. The Nasdaq Center is a nonprofit with a mission to help entrepreneurs from all over the globe realize their maximum potential and grow. And today, we're going to be doing that through the growth of understanding about connections. And speaking of connections, as you may have seen in the chat today, we are doing a lot around mentorship at the center. We know how much our entrepreneurs are going through in difficult times like COVID and beyond, and we want to be there in support of all that you're doing to empower our communities and the world. So on that note, we have built out a massive platform along with our partner Mentor Cloud, aimed to unlock 1 million hours of mentorship for more than 50,000 businesses in the coming year. And that's a big number, but it's there in support of you and inspired by you. So if you're looking to be able to tap into some technical expertise or some responsive support as you're going through trying to figure out pivots or challenges with your business, then we'd like to be able to help you do that. The process is super fast and simple. It takes just a minute to sign up and get access to the help and the expertise that we have through literally hundreds already on the platform. So we'd encourage you today to join, sign up, and get access to the help or provide that help that our entrepreneurs need in these times. We're going to be opening up for live Q&A throughout today, so please make sure that you take a moment and fill out those questions that you're going to see in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time that you're inspired to, for Susan to be able to answer, and we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can throughout today's conversation. Now, before we get started, none of what we do would be possible without the incredible generosity and kindness of all those who believe in the power of entrepreneurship and support the mission of the center. So to our sponsors and to the foundations that back us, thank you for all you do. For Nasdaq, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Soya, NZTE, and BPM, thank you. Now, we've got a couple of polls that we're going to launch today's session with, and then I promise you we're going to get into a great conversation on connection. The first poll that I want to launch, though, is something that we've been doing since before COVID, and it is really taking a pulse to just check in with each of you and ask the question, how are you doing? We know that the journey of an entrepreneur is challenging, to say the least, and there are thousands of things that you are working through at any time. To help us help you, we just want to take a better understanding of how you are doing right now. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a first poll and just invite you to share with us what is going on in your life. How are you feeling? How is your well-being right now as a founder? I'm going to give everyone just a moment to complete that. The signs of the times are promising, as we've been seeing in the last couple of months, definitely trending away from some of the challenges into more of an optimistic stance. But wherever you are, in whatever state you are going through, just know that we understand, we appreciate it, and we are here in support of all that you're doing. Thank you for everyone sharing that. I'm going to go ahead and share those results right now. Definitely a lot of optimism out there, but also a lot of you who are just trying to survive. And again, we completely understand and fully appreciate that as a sentiment for our entrepreneurs at this stage. The second poll that I'm going to launch is one that's really important to the center. If you are new or you don't necessarily know, we build programs for entrepreneurs based on what our entrepreneurs need. So we're always asking the question, what is keeping you up at night? And that will help us and our program team here put on the programs that you need. Conversations like Susan and others are inspired by you being able to share what your biggest struggles are right now. So if you need more help in sales, if it's marketing, if it's your team dynamics, if it's the financial side of the house, whatever you respond to here will help guide and inform our program team over the course of the next 10 to 12 weeks, shift and change those programs, reach out to the best and brightest minds to really help you unlock your maximum potential. So thank you so much for taking the time to help us get smarter around the skills and support that you need right now. I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. We've got a lot of finance help that is being needed right now, along with sales coming in at the top, and some of you that are going through pivot and then team and surviving. Again, fully understood on that side. So thank you so much for sharing and for helping us get smarter around the challenges that you're facing right now. Now, without any further delay, let's get to the heart of the conversation, which is the conversation of connecting today with an amazing champion of change in this place, Susan McPherson. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome in your chat. She is the author of The Lost Art of Connecting, the Gather, Ask, and Do method of building meaningful business relationships, a skill that we all try to get better at each and every day. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here. Oh, and I think we may still have a mute moment going on. Sorry, I know that always happens.
You would think after 13 months of this, we would have it down. Anyhow, I am blown away with everything the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center is doing. So kudos to you and your team. And certainly thank you to the sponsors that are making this possible. I am thrilled to be here, Nicola. Thank you so much.
Well, let's dig right in. Like I say, some amazing questions that have been coming in. And as a reminder to everyone joining us, if you have questions as we go through, please make sure you pop them into the Q&A. We're going to try to get to as many as we possibly can. But let's start out with a fun one of understanding your journey of where you are today and all of the amazing moments that have led you up to sort of experiencing entrepreneurship. Tell us about how you got started in this field and in this space, Susan.
Sure. Well, I joke that I've had 9 lives, but as of about 2 weeks ago, I now have 10 because I actually wrote a book. And for any of you who have gone through that process, it is quite laborious and time consuming. But I became an entrepreneur at the grand young age of 48, and I am now 56. And I have to tell you, I would never go back. But for those of you who are probably in your 30s or 40s, do not give up hope that you can also do it. But I will also say doing it at 48 made me that much more successful because I had spent my 20s and 30s and 40s building up an extraordinary community that actually showed up when it was time. But I have to say, I didn't have a burning desire. It wasn't kind of like this thing in me that I was like, oh, I want to run a company. In fact, I was actually terrified of the thought, but at age 48, I was at a consulting firm that there was an extraordinary number of people exiting. And for those of us who have worked in consulting, when there is an exit of talent, the writing's on the wall. So I knew I needed to find another job. But in the interim, a couple of individuals said, we'll hire you as a consultant for, a few months. So that would buy me time. So I was so nervous because I hadn't gone without a paycheck since I was 15. I left the company on a Friday and I started consulting on a Monday, okay? Because I thought they were going to change their mind. And even more, the company 8 years later, it's called McPherson Strategies. I never would have named it that if I thought it was going to become something because it's my ex-husband's name. Now, good news, he's a great guy, but we split up in 2003. So to me, it's kind of a little crazy that I named my company after someone so anyhow, I'm being extraordinarily open, but I just think it's important to know that I'm an accidental entrepreneur, but I thank my lucky stars that I took that scary leap of faith and am here today to talk about it.
No, we're so glad that you did. And accidental entrepreneurs are here to be celebrated because they usually are finding new opportunities that we otherwise would miss. So we're so glad that you're in this space and doing this work.
Thank you.
So I want to get into the conversation around communication and connections. And I'm going to start with a question that often surfaces, and that is actually the role of technology, or not, as the case may be, when it comes to facilitating good connections. Do you think technology has helped us really do a better job of connecting? And what role do you think technology should play when it comes to connecting intentionally in business?
Sure. Well, to give you just a little bit of background, The Lost Art of Connecting, which is my new book, was actually conceived 4 years ago, long before the pandemic. And it actually came out of my fear that we had become slaves to our technology, that we didn't have the humanity, and we were using the clicks and the likes as the followers as a means to measure our success in connecting, myself included. And a friend of mine had said to me that when she dropped her 10-year-old and 12-year-old off at the bus stop in the morning and then hugged them goodbye, she would watch them get up onto the bus, sit in their respective seats, and their heads would immediately bop down to look at their handheld devices. And all the other children on the school bus were doing the same thing. Now, I don't know about you. I don't have amazing memories of my school bus days. However, I did speak to my fellow classmates and I would ask them what they did the night before or what was coming the next day or that day in school. And I was raised by two parents that every morning would literally spread the 5 local newspapers plus yesterday's New York Times, because it would take a day late to get to upstate New York from New York City in the 70s. And they would be clipping and cutting articles that made them think of people, whether it was colleagues, whether it was relatives, whether my father was a professor for 40 years, former students, current students. And they literally kept the US Postal Service in business because they would go to their manual typewriters, type quick notes, say, I'm thinking of you, Cousin Harry, or Reporter Jim. My mother worked in PR for public television. And I thought everybody's parents did that. So 4 years ago, when I was putting forth this idea for my book, the proposal, it was trying to get some of the heart back, some of that intention. So I think to answer your question, Nicola, technology is a powerful thing. But if we don't use our humanity in it, we are losing the power to make meaningful connections. We're losing the possibilities of being able to research people before we reach out to them so that we know a little bit about them, rather than just cold emailing and saying, can I pick your brain? But instead saying, Nicola, I know you have 2 sons and, maybe there's a park near you that you want to recommend to you for your sons. And then say, do you have 10 minutes that you can maybe spend some time with me to help me with a project?
I love that. And you shared such an important part of sort of the criticality of the network of connections that were really being formed, and you had exposure of that through your parents. And I think you're a big believer that in life, we as humans aim to really connect that way, right? Like it is our very core of who we are as humans.
Well, one of the themes that runs through the entire book is pivoting what we think of networking as. And I'm not anti-networking, but when we think of networking, we tend to think of the give me, the get me, the numbers game. Walk into a room, whether it's a Zoom room or a real room, to walk away with like business cards. What I am suggesting is leading with how can I help rather than what can I get. And when you pivot like that and you turn your kind of thought process around, you actually engage with the other person on a more meaningful way. So to me, whether we're using technology to do that or we're doing it in real life is regardless. And it is the way to create much more meaningful relationships and connections over the long haul. And we were chatting a little bit before the session started. And when you actually see the magic that happens when you make connections that then go on to do things, you're hooked. I don't want to go so far as say it's crack or whatever, because I've never taken any, but it feels really good to see the magic and the stories that are created when you bring people together.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And, maybe along those lines, another amazing theme that comes out in the book is considering a different sort of idea to the traditional idea of networking. And that is really this constellation of relationships. So from your perspective, Susan, what does a constellation look like? And then maybe how can we intentionally build that up for ourselves as entrepreneurs that aim to do and apply this out in the real world?
Yeah, sure. Well, I will say if entrepreneurs have a constellations of connections, they will be more successful. But I will back up. If we think back to antiquity, I mean, we weren't around, but when we studied antiquity, what we learned was people looked up in the sky, and to help them understand what was happening, the sky was moving every night, right? Was to actually create stories, hence how the constellations came of being. And when you are introducing people and connecting people, you are creating tapestries of stories that are constantly going to ebb and flow and build upon each other. And when you are an entrepreneur, you need different pockets of, different concentric circles to pull from for various experts, for funders, for, for hiring. And that isn't a static thing, and it's not something that you like do one and done. So that is kind of the theme of connecting to what a constellation is versus just a linear line of just a one and done, high and by. And I hope that makes sense. It's a little crystal woo-woo, but If you look at the cover of the book, it's like overlapping circles, right?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I love that. And I think it's perfect within entrepreneurship because so much of the unknown is formed by getting to have conversations with great people that inspire and guide us of what the next chapter looks like, right? And that's the whole outcome of what's possible when you connect at that human level, which you talk so perfectly about.
Thank you.
So I want to go a little deeper. Tell me more about what you mean when you say gather, ask, do. What is
Sure.
that strategy? How do we do that well?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you a funny little secret. When you write a business book, you have to come up with a methodology. It's like you don't get the deal if you don't come up with a methodology. And my entire life, I have been a connector. And I can't tell you how many people over the years was like, you really need to write a book and share your methodology. And I was kind of like, I don't know how I do it. But I honestly then did the deep reflection and I realized there's actually a methodology and it's not a one and done. I've done it my whole life and I will continue to do it. So the book essentially is broken into 3 parts. And the gather part is the first. And the most important part of gather is first doing some deep reflection. Number 1, and this is something we all who are attending today can think about this. What is a meaningful connection to you? Okay, because what is a meaningful connection for me may be very different than Brittany and you, Nicola, and Colin and Isis and other people involved in today's chat. So I think it's important, first of all. The next component of gather is think about the goals you want to achieve in the next 4 years, 4 months, 4 weeks. And what is the community or communities you need to build around you that is going to help you meet those goals? How are you going to ensure that that community or those communities don't just look like you, sound like you, the same age as you? And lastly, what is the chief differentiating factor or your secret sauce that you can bring to that community or those communities? Okay, so that's gather. Ask is a little different than what we normally think of ask, which is very important, and I do cover in the book, but in this case, the ask is not about asking for what you want, need, and deserve, but that is covered. In this case, it's learning to ask the right questions of others that will drive and let you know or have a window into what is important to that person. What are the hopes and dreams of that person? And if you listen very carefully during the ask phase, you get to go to phase 3, which is my favorite place to be, and that's the do. And that's when you can become the helpful, reliable, and all-important, trustworthy person that follows through and helps, makes connections, makes introductions. So that's gather, ask, do. And I will go so far as say, we are in what I've almost been calling purgatory, right? We know we are getting close to some semblance of return of normalcy. What that normalcy is, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. However, we kind of have one toe out the door. I joke for people who live where I live in New York City, where you live in apartment buildings. It's a little like when your neighbor orders a very aromatic dinner, maybe Indian food or Thai food, and you can smell it, but you don't get any. So that's kind of where we are right now. But to me, this is the perfect time. We have a do-over opportunity where we can actually be thinking about the communities that we want to build. And if you're an entrepreneur, you do need to be thinking about this and looking ahead at the next 4 months. Maybe 4 years is a little too far out. What is the community that you can create around you that's going to help you meet those goals?
Intentional community building. I love that.
Bingo. You said it. Look at you. Cut right to the chase. I'm going on and on and on. And you just said it.
Well, so not to go soundbitey by any means, Susan, but one of the fun comments that is in the book is really moving from FOMO to JOMO. What does that mean? What is JOMO? Tell us that.
Yes. Well, I had FOMO as early as in high school when I would come back to school on a Monday and learn about all the parties I wasn't invited to over the weekend. But I think with the world of Instagram and everything, we see in real time when we don't get invited. But more from a business perspective, in the early 90s, I was running a sales territory of all places, Orange County, California. And the company I was working for, no one knew. And the competitor literally was the brand name. And I was working for a company called PR Newswire. And at the time, the company Business Wire was the big, the big honcho in town. So I wasn't getting invited to the events, to the lunches. I couldn't open doors. So I just decided, look, I'm going to invite the 3 or 4 people that I actually knew for a coffee and ask each of them to bring a respective business, like a business person they knew. So what started as 4 eventually turned into 150 public relations professionals. And what I learned was that if we turn FOMO on its head, instead of the joy of missing out and make it the joy of meeting others, then we become the convener and we don't have to worry about not being invited because we're doing the inviting. And for those of you who may be shy or introverted, you're not inviting 50 people. You can start with 3 or 4. And it can be it can be a community walk, it can be a picnic, it can be a business luncheon. But to me, that is a way to pivot. And we all know that those of us who are conveners hold a bit of power. So that's the joy of meeting others.
Joy of meeting others. That's just, it's a great moment to own and realize that power dynamic can be flipped in that light switch.
Absolutely.
Now, along those lines, obviously we know, and you've already shared this today, that it starts by first sort of switching gears and saying, how can I help you? Not how can this person help me? In those moments, a lot of us may worry, can I help this person? What if I can't? Yeah. So a 2-part question, if you'll indulge. One is, how has this approach actually manifested? Like, is that a legitimate worry? And what happens if, in fact, you feel like you're letting the person down because you can't deliver on what they need? And second is, what is sort of that tactical advice to helping people apply that strategy throughout their communication styles and throughout their connections that they have in business?
Sure. Well, first of all, I will tell you a little trick that I learned. The more people I have connected with in my life, the more efficient I've gotten, because it meant that there were other people I could tap into to help when I couldn't do the helping. Of course, we're not, I mean, unless we're Superman or Superwoman, we can't help everyone. And I don't think that is the expectation. And also keep in mind, it is completely within the reality of life to be able to say, I can't help you right now because life is getting in the way. All the things, an ill child, an ill family member, a job loss, etc. But that doesn't mean that you can't make a note and 6 months later go back to the person and say, I know I wasn't able to help 6 months ago, but I have a little bit of spare time now. Okay. And sometimes that just takes the intentionality of making note, right? Sometimes, we want to do these things, but we just don't think to do them or we forget about them. Secondly, as mentioned, your pool of candidates grows so that it is not you having to do all the helping. And it's magical because, as your constellations of connections grows, you literally have so much more variety from which to pull from. So if somebody says to me, Susan, I'm working on this coral restoration project. Do you happen to know anyone? Or can you help? No, I don't know how to do coral restoration, but chances are someone I know or someone I know knows someone. Okay. So I want to make sure that people get it. It's not you having to be the helper, but it's listening to people and getting a sense of what's important so that you can then follow up and be helpful, whatever way you can be helpful. And can you repeat the second question? Because of course I forgot what it was.
Oh, no. In so many ways, I think that's perfect. I will actually ask though a follow on to that. We are, and it dovetails into the next question that I wanted to ask you, which we'll get to in a second, but we're all running at breakneck speed right now. It feels like on the one hand, pandemic initially invited us to slow down. And now I think every entrepreneur out there is taking as many meetings as they possibly can. What are some of the practical ways that you embed sort of that slow down environment to make sure that you're doing the follow through, that you're doing the communication ask at the beginning of the meeting, that you don't just sort of roll right into the agenda without that check-in? I mean, do you actually sort of save time in your meetings for that initial? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm in a privileged position because I run a company and I have 12 employees, soon to be 14. And we always open our meetings with a check-in on each person. And, this past year, I mean, I'm going to be completely honest, has been extraordinarily challenging for me in the sense that I have been totally alone. I am, I don't have children, I don't have a partner, and I don't have parents. And so for 13 months, I'm kind of sick of myself, right? And there would be, and I first want to also just add, yes, it's been extraordinarily lonely, but I have had a livelihood. I've had a paycheck. I have had food, and I've maintained my health. And so obviously people have had it dramatically worse. And so I don't ever want to shortchange that at all. But there have been times during the year that I would come to meetings with my employees and I would have tears in my eyes. And there was part of me, it's like, oh, I have to be Superwoman. And then I realized it's like, no, because if I show a bit of vulnerability, then guess what? They have the space to share their own. And it's been magical to watch because many of them have never met in real life. And yet we all have to work together very closely, for a variety of clients doing very important work around social impact. And that giving people the space to be open and vulnerable has been something that I have learned. And I really recommend to all of you that, you can't expect people to meaningfully connect at the office if you're not going to also be open and vulnerable yourself.
I love that. With one toe out the door and that aromatic smell on the horizon, we still are obviously all doing business virtually.
Right.
And trying to connect in ways that we have never been told how to do well in the past. I find myself always trying to do like that crazy lean in to try to read people on screens. How have you found in this moment in time opportunities to connect richly and meaningfully with technology as sort of the mediator to that connection?
Of course. Well, a couple of things. One thing, every morning I reach out to 3 to 5 people via text, some via phone, some via WhatsApp, some via email. And it's not like I'm going through this master Excel spreadsheet. It's literally people who pop in my brain. So there isn't, I wish there was a much more rigor, but there's twofold. One, I want to send a bit of joy out into the world. Okay. And this is personal and business. So, it's not like there's a delineation. And 2, it is my way of saying, hey, I'm here. Don't forget about me. So it's kind of solving 2 kind of holes, I guess, for lack of better terms. I also think, this is the time to reach out to people that perhaps you've let the relationship maybe lax, and address the elephant in the room and use this pandemic's been so awful. Let's use it for something, and actually say to people, I know this has been a tough year on so many people. How are you doing? Is there anything I can be doing to be helpful to you? And you can do that to business, to funders, to investors, to employees. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. And by doing that, you're not only sending, of course, a bit of joy out in the world, you're also helping yourself. So I don't know how technical that is, but it's using whatever technical tools you're most comfortable using, because quite frankly, I've learned you're going to use whatever is easiest or whatever you feel most comfortable. I also do recommend sometimes, and I often do this when I make new connections, business and personal. What is your favorite mode of receiving? Because sometimes also you can be more effective connecting and communicating if the person on the receiving end is receiving in the way that he or she or they want to.
That's a great piece of advice. Obviously mentorship is core to everything that the center believes in. I'm going to ask you to sort of share, if you don't mind, how's mentorship made a difference in your life, Susan, and maybe an experience of a mentor that supported you in your career?
Yes. Well, I mentioned to you the experience of learning sales in early on in my career. I often say my experience as a salesperson and my experience as a waitress in college, which I did for 4 years in college, actually were the 2 jobs that prepared me for life, because they both taught me about how humans operate, humans' wishes and desires. But the woman who hired me at PR Newswire, and she is featured in my book, taught me everything there is to know about sales. And I don't think of it as sales. What she taught me, and get this, her name is Nancy Sells. And what she taught me was, and many of you who are on the phone and are in some, business cultivation, sales, et cetera, relationship formation, she taught me, of course, that it was not about selling something to somebody, but instead finding out what that person needs and desires and then fulfilling that need. And I learned early on under her tutelage that once a month I would go through my proverbial Rolodex. And yes, it was a Rolodex in 1991. And I would call every single person. Didn't always get through to the person because in those days there were gatekeepers, there were administrative assistants and secretaries. And I would say, I'm just checking in to find out how you are doing. That was it. It wasn't to call to sell the newswire or up the sale or add more to the product sales. It was more, hi, I'm just checking in to see if you need something. And to this day, I just shared with you that I reach out to 3 to 5 people. That has stuck with me. And I learned this from Nancy Sells, who, by the way, now continues to do global sales training for the company Richardson, which is one of the world-renowned sales training leaders. She works 1 day a month in well, not this past year, but she would literally, it's the perfect sales training job. But anyhow, so she was my mentor.
Aww. That's such great advice. And I love how it's translated into so many facets, your personal connections, your business connections, absolutely everything, and prioritization on that. That's great. Now, for a lot of our entrepreneurs, one of the worries that they sort of have to get over and deal with and work through is the fear that they don't have a big enough network to really achieve the impact and the outcomes that they want. What advice do you have for people that are sort of just building out that Rolodex?
Sure. Well, first of all, start with everyone you know. Okay. And when I say everyone you know, I don't just mean, the people you work with, your neighbors, if you belong to a faith-based organization, your cousins, your family members, the local community that you live in. And then I would suggest more than anything is get involved in nonprofit organizations in your community. Okay. And I realize the thought is, oh God, more time, or they're going to want me to make a donation, et cetera. They're going to want your business acumen. They're going to want your brain. And I have found over the years, whenever I would move to a new city, by joining a local organization, not only would I learn about things that I didn't experience personally, but I would meet people who were not like me. And it would help me grow and understand more about myself. But you as a young entrepreneur and just starting out, it is a tremendous way to not only learn about things that you can take to your business, but you also expand your community and it will start growing upon itself.
Perfect. As we kind of come through the next handful of months and start to re-enter to a new norm, there is some worry or some fear around how we're going to do that transition well. Do you have any tips, Susan, for what we can be thinking of intentionally as we reconnect back in person with our connections?
Sure. Well, during the gather phase is when you very intentionally look at your community now. So to me, this is a perfect time to start reaching out to folks and being very intentional about, maybe you want to see if they'll spend 10 minutes on the phone with you, but remember, or, text, however you want to engage, but remember with leading with how you can be helpful to them as opposed to making it all by yourself. Secondly, I do believe we're not going to go 0 to 60. This isn't going to be like all of a sudden. And I joked on an interview yesterday, we're not going to, for history buffs, we're not going to see Times Square in 1945, which you saw thousands of people dancing and hugging and kissing in the streets. It would be fun, but that isn't in the cards. And I honestly think for people who are a little trepidatious or nervous, it's a little like riding a bike, right? It's going to be scary for the first few blocks, at least for me. And every year is when I take my bike out of storage and I'm terrified because I think I'm going to wipe out. But usually by the third block, I got it down. So I think baby steps, start small, reach out to people you're first, you obviously gravitate towards, but then also now is the time. We have a few months. So start really being intentional about that community you want to build around you.
Hmm. We've had some lovely transparent questions that have been shared in Q&A. So I'm gonna inject these here because I think it's a great time to do so, especially on the cusp of some of that great advice. The first is from someone that has shared, it's been a while since they reached out. They went through a lot of personal and business challenges, and they want to reconnect with people, but it's been years. And they're a little worried about how they do that well and sort of talk and address the elephant in the room of the years that have gone by. Advice and tips for that. And then on the second part of that, they're also really struggling with like worrying about being a salesperson and getting a bit tongue-tied. How do you help people sort of overcome that fear? Or what advice do you have on that side too?
Well, first of all, I'm very, very sorry for your losses. And as someone who has suffered a lot of loss, sadly, my mother was killed when I was 21. So talk about like grounding, like everything and anything I've ever done. So I do feel I have a little bit of qualification here. First and foremost, it is okay for you to mention the elephant in the room when you reach out to people and state you've gone through some tough times and you haven't been the best communicator or the best connector, but you now are ready to reemerge and you would very much like to re-engage with them. I think just like, I keep saying the elephant in the room, and somebody has to help me understand where that statement came from, because is there really ever been an elephant in the room? But I think also, this is the thing where you also have to look inside yourself and realize you have secret sauce. You have superpowers to offer. And that fear of what am I going to talk about? If in my book, I talk about gather, ask, do. And the good thing about ask is it's not about you. You don't have to be talking about you. What you can be doing is asking people questions, which for people who may be introverted or shy or tongue-tied is a more comfortable place. And just to give you a few examples of questions you can be asking, just to have in your back pocket, things address the obvious. I know it's been a really tough year. Is there anything I can be helpful to you to help you get through? Or if you could pick one place on earth that you could fly to when this is all over, where would it be? And why did you pick that? These types of questions, then you get to close your mouth, use why we have two ears and one mouth, and then just listen. So hopefully for people who may feel a little tongue-tied or nervous, those are totally acceptable questions. And lastly, if you are a salesperson, get out of selling and asking. You want to be asking far more than you want to be talking and spewing, if that's appropriate to say.
We'll take it. It's fantastic advice, and I think just good for all of us, reminding ourselves to listen more than talk, because that's the point to connections. Speaking of point to connections, the other question that came in is a really good one, and man, have there been so many journals and blogs and books that have thought about this. But I want to hear from you, and so does this person too. How do we think, or tips or tricks perhaps, for communications and connectings with women versus men? So like that gender intentionality, are there differences that you've noted? Do we do things differently to get better outcomes here?
And that's a really challenging question, because there's so many generalizations, right? I mean, you're making assumptions that all men are this way and all women are this way. And, we know that's not the case. I think it's being very important to be culturally sensitive and read the room and read others, and know that even if somebody is you're talking to as a man, don't assume things because that person is male. So I almost think that you really it's not about the gender. There are plenty of people that are gender experts that can give you probably much more, scientific answers to that. I specifically didn't write the book as with a gender lens. Obviously, it's written from a woman, and a woman who who goes by being a woman. So, take that if you do read the book, know that. But I also advise for women that it's very helpful to almost have two networks and actually have a network that is that heavily weighs male, because we know, and this is no offense to the men in the room, but we still very much live in a patriarchy. Boardrooms, C-suites, investing is definitely still very skewed to men. So it's very important that women learn from men. But we also, women, need our women's circles, because we have unique challenges that we have to face, and we need the support and camaraderie of one another. But again, these are generalizations.
Yeah, no, really thoughtful. I appreciate those intentions that were shared there. Another great question has come in from Martina. Martina, thanks so much for sharing, asking for some practical tool insights on keeping track of these conversations and communications. My goodness, between LinkedIn and Gmail, it's so tricky to sort of follow the threads of everything that is going on. Do you have any sort of tricks that have worked for you for just staying on top of all of this? Do you use Outlook? Anything else? I'm having a feeling Susan's, no bet. I love it.
Martina, God love you. I have to say, and maybe because I'm, of age, I have found that actually writing things down is the most effective way for me. I'm also a slave to the calendar. Like when if I know, for instance, I want to remember to get back to somebody in 2 months, I put it in my June or July. Like I will put it in on a Saturday, and I will put it as a calendar entry. I mean, that may sound insane, but that works for me. The other thing that I do, and hopefully is something I would love to inspire you all to do, how many of us have been on walks and someone pops in our head and we just then let it go? The minute that person pops in my head, I use my voice memo on my handheld and I record it. Because I know that will just be a fleeting thought, like a star in the sky. And I don't want to lose that, because that person popped in my brain for a reason. And, obviously I found LinkedIn over the years to be effective, but one of the things I don't do with LinkedIn is, as soon as I connect with somebody, ask them for something. And we've all been the recipients of those, right? We connect, and then the next thing we know, somebody's trying to sell us their service, and instead, what I often do, if I want to build a more meaningful relationship, is I say something about them that I have read or seen, and then I say, look, in the next few weeks, I'd love to have 5 minutes with you to see how I can be helpful to you.
So good. Such great insights. There was a fantastic, kind of in a similar genre, if you'll indulge, pre-submitted question. Thank you for all of those that filled that out and helped us sort of shape the conversation that we're having today with Susan. But this question really aimed to understand the worry about whether people really wanted to be in a conversation. So how do you handle, Susan, like that fear factor of like keep trying to show up, but the other person just seems resistant to the actual connection? Do you bring that up directly? Do you sort of let it play out and hope for the best? What are your strategies for sort of dealing with that?
First of all, we'll just address, it's awful, right? We all know. But the first question to the question is it somebody you have to work with? Okay. Mm-hmm. Because obviously if it's a colleague that you have to work with on a daily basis, you are going to have to kind of figure it out. And I am a big believer in being very intentional and direct and trying to take emotion out of it. I'm not always successful at it because I wear my heart on my sleeve. But I think if it is somebody you work with, I think it's very important to state, look, we don't have the greatest relationship, but we have a joint mission, both working at this company, and we have to get this project done. So let's figure out how we can be most successful together without having to hang out and be buddies. Like, just be very, very direct and remove emotion. If it is not somebody you have to work with, I hate to say this, but there's 10.6 billion, I think, I don't know the latest number, on this planet. And if somebody is really pushing back, you know what? It's time to walk. I mean, it just is. And believe me, it took me probably to age 50 to be okay with that. So I'm not suggesting it's easy, but you're going to actually help yourself if you do.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, their entrepreneurs are always in part sharing their vision, putting themselves out there first and foremost, perhaps even beyond their product. We had a great question that just literally hit the screen around how do you help someone communicate and ultimately sell something that hasn't been proven yet? What should they be thinking through?
Well, we all know you need to have third party credibility, right? And generally speaking, you can find people who are close to you who will try the product and give you feedback. And obviously, if the product isn't ready for prime time, it's not ready for prime time. And you can't, a product that isn't good isn't going to sell. So to me is, you really want to figure out who is your brain trust, who are the people that you can get testing that are going to, really kind of hammer at whatever the product is or service it is and give you feedback. Because I don't think it's healthy to go out and start quote unquote, proposing a product or service that isn't ready, right? So I would focus on getting it to the point where it is something that is going to enchant people and people are going to. As opposed to how do I sell something that isn't proven?
That's a great reframe. And it's an important one for us all to probably remember there. And also to unlock that network, right? Again, I think it goes back to that great advice of like, find your champions, build up those champions. They're going to continue to be there for you when you need them in moments like these.
Exactly. And when you lead with, how can I be helpful? Guess what? When you do need help, it's a lot easier.
It's a great way to ask it, right? So I think a lot of our introverts out there would still appreciate maybe a few additional words of wisdom on like how they can get over that fear of connection and starting a conversation with someone they've never met before. I know it's an ongoing journey, but it's also something that I think we can learn a lot from you on. So what other advice would you have for introverts struggling with this domain?
Well, I was fortunate enough to interview a nationally renowned introvert named Maura Aarons-Mele. She wrote a book called Hiding in the Bathroom, and she has a wonderful podcast called The Anxious Achiever. And I'll just tell you a quick side note. There have been many times I've hidden in the bathroom. And I know I seem like the consummate extrovert, but I am tiny. And when I walk in a room, nobody sees me. So sometimes I just want to hide. Okay, so just telling you. However, in the book, after talking to Maura, I came up with what I think is very helpful for introverts to carry with them, whether they are in a Zoom room or a Microsoft Teams room, or when we get back to the real world. And that is, think of the power of three. Go with the intention of meeting three people, sharing three things, and walking away with three new ideas. Okay. That's something that's kind of like, oh, I can do that, right? Now, granted, I'm not an introvert, but that seems palatable. Another suggestion is, if you can, before you go to the event, get a sense of who's going to be in the room and see who the connector is in the room. Because if you want to meet somebody in that room and kind of draft off the person, that's the person you want to connect with. So for instance, at that next event that I'm at, and you happen to be there, you're going to want to connect with me, because then you get to meet the other people. I'm being silly, but I think that this can help you get over that fear. And remember, it isn't a numbers game. It is much more important to build smaller, meaningful relationships than trying to collect and connect with hundreds and then never having any follow through.
Speaking of meaningful, a lot of our entrepreneurs at different times have to have meaningfully difficult conversations where they're more vulnerable perhaps than previous environments might encourage them to be. How has vulnerability in your mind created opportunities for meaningful connections to really be forged in those? And how do entrepreneurs sort of deal with those transparent, difficult conversations around missed dates that were promised to a client, or missed expectations of product features or functions or service deliverables?
Well, I run a consulting firm, so when we miss deliverables, it's a little bit different, because it's not like there's a product on the assembly line, but it's just as treacherous. And I have always, and my team is probably like so sick of me saying this, address the obvious, take the lead, anticipatory, right? And be very, very open and honest. No one will ever, I shouldn't say no one, but when you lead with honesty and transparency, your reputation will carry you through because people inevitably will trust you. So the second you learn that you're going to miss a deadline, that's the moment you share with the client, with the customer, with your employee. Don't wait. And lastly, don't try to hide it. And I will also say, one of the few silver linings of this past year is that we're all dealing with vulnerability. We're all dealing with missed deadlines. And, I was supposed to get a couch delivered on my roof deck. It's like 6 weeks late, right? And had the company been upfront and told me in the beginning, like I would have had a much better kind of perception. So I guess my sense is, what, this is the time to actually lead with, what, we're not going to meet the deadline, but we're going to, do everything we can to make it up to you and blah, 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 blah. So hopefully that's helpful.
Oh, it's incredibly helpful. I'm going to go off script for a minute and we have time for just a couple more questions. If anyone has anything, please go ahead and pop them into the Q&A. We often hear from our entrepreneurs a real challenge around the separation of work and the separation of life. And for many entrepreneurs, they struggle with really trying to protect both sides and do it well. And it's so difficult because there's only so many hours in the day to do that. When you think about work-life integration, I'm not going to use the word balance, but when you think about the integration of the communications and the conversations that happen, how can connecting help us think through a positive integration experience versus dealing with some of these challenges around protecting relationships on this side versus that?
Well, I can share for me. About 15 years ago, I stopped being work Susan and home Susan. It was exhausting being two people, honestly. And I found that everything intersected. And quite frankly, it was probably in the mid 90s when email was developed, that all of a sudden that work and home just disappeared, because I would be doing my dishes and then dialing up to CompuServe to send my email in between the dishes. So all of a sudden, like what had become separate was already long gone. And as I continued on this path of leading, social impact companies, serving on nonprofit boards, everything all just kind of glommed together. And actually, I have become more successful because of that, because I don't try to delineate. I'm not suggesting that we, work, 100 hours a day, none of that. But it's not like we have to put on our work hat and then our home hat to be successful. So I think you will also see, and I think many of you as entrepreneurs see this, that many of you socialize with people you are working with, and that's okay too. So I think maybe instead of focusing on how we keep them separate, is how do we actually make them coexist in a harmonious way, right?
I like that. And for the fact that it is all part of who you are, they will benefit by having those connections, know about them.
You're you, and you're not two yous.
No. Thank goodness.
That's hard enough,
right? There is the very real fear and worry of power balance being an entrepreneur, and certainly showing up with someone who has amazing tenure, history, experience as a C-level exec. What tips, this just came in from an attendee today, do you have for an icebreaker, if you will, with one of these amazing C-level execs that we're fortunate to engage with? And like, how does one think about coaching through that accessibility and that power play in that room?
Well, the beautiful thing is, thanks to technology, we have all the tools necessary to prep for a meeting like that. And in my book, I call it like prepare your Oscar speech, meaning get to know as much as you can about that person, that you could give that person's Oscar speech. In other words, if that person was about to win an Oscar. That way, when you are setting up to meet, in meeting with them, you can I'm going to use the word regurgitate back all the things that that person has done that actually opens up to like a meaningful conversation. I would also ensure that you aren't all making the meeting about what you're going to get from that person. And I know I sound like a broken record, but even a C-suite executive can use help. All right. So I would be thinking about not only once you know a good deal about that person, but what can you be doing to help that person? And if you do a little bit of research, you can find out what that person is working on. And maybe you can even find out what is challenging that person. But to me, that is a great way to start the conversation, as opposed to what can that person do for me because he or she or they are at a higher, perceived level.
Ah, that's so great. And I think that again sort of breaks down the how do I deal with this really big thing into like a meaningful series of steps that starts to make it less scary and more human, which is what it's all about. Um, I want to make sure that we have a chance to ask perhaps one of the most important questions that we have in front of us today. What's the one, if you will, salient piece of advice that you really hope entrepreneurs are going to walk away with? Anyone reading the book, forget just aspiring current entrepreneurs, humans are going to walk away with from this book that will really live with them each and every day.
I would have to say two important messages. Lead with curiosity because we don't know what we don't know. And that is actually what makes life worth living. And always think about how you can be helpful to others.
And what a perfect note to say, Susan. It has been an absolute pleasure and joy today. Thank you so much for inspiring, for taking away that fear factor, for reminding us about the joy of meeting others, hopefully not only virtually, but in person as we come out of the pandemic. Really masterfully. Thank you so much for all you've shared today.
Nicola, thank you. You are a masterful interviewer. I am entirely impressed, and I am so appreciative of your wonderful audience being so inquisitive. So thank you very, very much.
Yes, and that's a perfect segue. For those of you joining us today, thank you so much for your time, for your attention, for your thoughtful questions. We are going to make sure that we follow up with some great information on how you can access Susan's book, both today in the chat and then following up in our email to each of you. Please stay tuned for some more upcoming programs that were designed with you in mind for how we can next help you overcome those business challenges ahead of you. And our ask back, because we do have one ask that we would end today on, we can only get smarter by inviting you to share your feedback from today. So if you would do us a favor, please complete that survey and that feedback link that you're going to find both in the chat and in the follow-up. Let us know what were your takeaways from today's session and what more can we be doing in support of all you're doing for us. Again, thank you to our sponsors, to Susan, and to our amazing team that make all of this work possible. It's been a joy, and we will all see you soon. Take care. Thank you.